Professor Mackridge, good morning.
Good morning.
It's a great pleasure for us. You accepted to offer this interview. We would like to start by asking you about your family background. If you would like to say a few things about your parents, your sisters or brothers, and your early influences during your childhood.
Well, I mean, I'm the first person in my family to have gone to university. So I suppose, you know, I'm a beneficiary of the post-war regime, you know, that we had in England, where people were sent to university on full grants, etc. You know, we didn't have to pay anything to go to university and all that. Those were those golden days where we were very lucky. But my parents didn't go to university. I think they both had the qualifications to go, but their parents didn't have enough money. I mean, both my grandfathers were what I call mechanics. They were actually engine fitters, so they were skilled manual labourers. Obviously my father moved up socially because having worked during the interwar period at Shell Petroleum in London, he was in the advertising department, the publicity department. Having served in the British Army in the war, he came back to England and started up his own advertising company. So he had his own company. It was very small and not particularly successful, but you know, at least he was able to. He actually was able to send me away to private schools.
That was just after the war.
Yes, he started his business. I don't know when, but I mean, I was born in 1946. He must have started his business sometime soon after that, I think. But although my parents hadn't been to university, they were both, you know, they were both quite wide readers. My mother would read novels more than anything else. My father was not only very well read in literature, but also in history. He was, I mean, I would call him an amateur historian. Not that he ever wrote anything, and certainly not published anything about history, not at all. But he read a lot of history, mostly English history, but he knew a lot about world history. And this, you know, was an interest that lasted him throughout his life, in fact. He died at the age of 95, just 10 years ago, in 2004. And clearly his interest in history must have influenced my interest in, well, not so much history, but my interest in the past anyway, and my interest in trying to discover more about the past, you know, a sense that the past could be known. It was a foreign country, but it could be explored and it could be known. But it was the literary side of both my parents, I suppose, that really pushed me into my career rather than the historical side, as you know, because I mean my job was always as a teacher of literature rather than history. But I mean, I was brought up about 30 miles away from London, and for some years, from the age of 2 onwards, of course I don't remember anything before that, but from the age of 2 onwards, we were living in a village in Surrey, and then we moved, in fact, outside the village. We were between 2 villages, and my childhood was spent surrounded by rivers and woods and farms and riding stables and all that sort of thing, pigs and cows and sheep and everything, and lots of walks in the country. And you know, I've retained a great love of the natural world because of that. And my parents were both very you know, very keen nature lovers themselves, even though they were born in sort of rather suburban backgrounds. But so those were very important influences. I have 2 younger brothers, but because I was the first to be born, and then my mother had a daughter, Anne, who unfortunately died within a few weeks, perhaps even a few days of her birth. there was actually quite a long gap between me and my next brother, Rafe, who was 5.5 years younger than me. And then John was 2 years younger, I mean, they're still going strong. And so for the first 5.5 years of my life, I was an only child, and I think that influenced my personality. You know, I've always been a very kind of independent, not very sociable person, actually. I mean, I learned to become sociable, but I wasn't naturally sociable, as it were. I had to sort of teach myself how to be sociable. And, you know, friends haven't really, I mean, I don't have many friends of my own individually. I mean, Jackie and I, my wife and I, have friends between us, but I don't go off on my own and see, let's say, male friends, you know, in this sort of buddy kind of thing. You know, one of the things I really hate about the cinema is so-called road movies where there are two men crossing America on a motorbike or in a car. I find that, you know, totally an off-putting thing. In fact, I much prefer female company to male company myself. But that's because I was deprived of it when I was a child, I think, you know, not having a sister.
You grew up with two brothers.
I grew up with two brothers. My poor mother was the only woman in the house, and she made us realise that she felt very much, you know, a sort of minority of one. You know, she was dominated by the males in the house. And then, you know, when I went to school, I went to single-sex schools, apart from 1 year when I was 5 years old. My first year of school was in a mixed school. I had girlfriends at the age of 5 or 6. But after that, I went to single-sex schools, and
just boys.
You know, females were sort of very much sort of not part of my life. And then, you know, living as we did out in the country. You know, we were only about 4 miles from a town, Guildford, but that was far enough. It meant that there wasn't a big circle of people around anyway. We didn't have many neighbours, let alone, you know, other children who were friends of mine. So I didn't have many friends. But I think I was never, I mean, my mother always used to say to me, I was never bored. You know, I mean, how kids get bored. They sit around saying, Mum, I don't know what to do, I'm bored. I never used to do that. I always used to find things to do. I mean, things to do, you know, kind of intellectually. Reading, writing, playing games, you know, sort of on my own, really, until my brothers came along, and then I would play games with them. I mean, my brothers, having said that I didn't have many friends, I would say that my brothers were my best friends, in fact. I mean, I've always got on very well with them, and I still do. And, you know, one of the sort of, you know, what people imagine, you know, what's the ideal dinner party? Who would you invite, you know, to the ideal dinner party? And I would say my brothers and their wives as well, because I get on very well with them too. And you know, we all get on very well together, which is very nice. And Jackie gets on with them as well. So we're quite a happy family in that way.
And then, how about the school years?
The first proper school I went to was a preparatory school. That was a private school in Guildford, which meant that I commuted on the bus every day. You know, it's not very far. It only took about 20 minutes on the bus. There, I must have started doing Latin very early. I don't know how old. I mean, I was at the school from the age of 6 to the age of 11. And so, let's say I started doing Latin maybe at the age of 8. And there was one Latin teacher, one classics teacher there called Mr. Aldridge. I'm going to say one. He was the only one who taught classics. He was a wonderful teacher and a wonderful man altogether. He was an RAF war hero, and he had been shot down at some point in his plane, and he lost both his legs, and he had artificial legs. But that didn't stop him from being quite a good rugby umpire. And he used to run around on these 2 artificial legs with his whistle, running after the boys who had the ball, you know, and making sure that the rules were being kept. Anyway, he took me aside one day, because I obviously must have been good at Latin, and said, have you ever thought about doing Greek, studying Greek? And I remember him saying,
was this an optional course? just for the people who work beyond the ideal?
I'm not going to start explaining to you, the very complicated systems that we have, education systems we have in this country, and of course they change from time to time as they do in Greece. But it's very, very complicated, and really at private schools in those days they were practically free to do what they wanted. Aldridge wanted somebody to teach Greek to, and he said to me, Greek is a much more civilized language than Latin. I remember him saying, because he said, okay, both the Greeks and the Romans wrote about war, but the Greeks wrote about much more interesting things as well, the drama and the philosophy and everything else as well. So he said, if you're interested in doing Greek, I think you'd be good at it, but go away and talk to your parents about it. My parents had never studied Greek. They had done Latin at school because Latin was compulsory in those days, in their day. I think my father thought really that classics was, he had some kind of romantic idea about the classics as being not only romantic actually, but rather practical too, because in the circles in which he was moving, even though he came from quite a modest background, he had clients who were obviously richer than he was. He came across people who had university degrees from Oxford or Cambridge in classics, and he was obviously impressed by this and thought, this is the makings of a successful career if you have an Oxford or Cambridge degree in classics. It had to be Oxford or Cambridge as far as he was concerned. He didn't want his sons to go anywhere else. I went to Oxford. My two brothers, neither of them actually went to Oxford or Cambridge, but still they went to university. So anyway, my parents were encouraging, and I continued to do Greek. I started to do Greek. So probably for the last year or two of my school there. Then I changed school to a grammar school, which is a state school, also in Guildford, but they didn't do Greek there. It wasn't part of the syllabus. Because it was a state school, it was a much more regimented syllabus, unlike the private school where they were much freer to teach what they wanted. And so they did Latin, not Greek, and I found because of this, I think, although I didn't realise it at the time, that I wasn't performing so well at this grammar school. From being top of the class at the prep school, I was finding myself being almost bottom of the class at the grammar school. This was, of course, partly because grammar schools, as you know, were selective schools. In other words, you got into a grammar school on the basis of an examination, a competitive examination called the 11 plus. This was a national examination which doesn't exist any longer. And so all the boys who were at my grammar school had, by definition, passed the 11 plus examination. My father was clever enough to realise that something was wrong, and that, why had I suddenly changed from being the top of the class to somewhere near the bottom? And he said, is it because you're not doing Greek? And I said, well, maybe it is. I hadn't really thought about that, but maybe it is. I'm not so happy. And so amazingly, he arranged for me to go to a private boarding school at Eastbourne on the coast near Brighton. And without him knowing anything about classics, it just happened by amazing coincidence, amazing luck for me, that the teachers of classics at my public school, from the age of 13 to 17 that is, were absolutely brilliant. They were people that I really liked. I really liked them as human beings. They were inspiring teachers, especially two of them, including the headmaster actually, Michael Burley, who didn't really have any duties to teach, but he liked teaching occasionally. And it was a great luxury, because the headmaster, who was actually very young at the time, but to us he was like a god, would descend to the classroom and teach us. He didn't teach anybody else. He only taught those who were doing advanced Latin and Greek, especially Greek. And we would read, for instance, Euripides together, even though they were not part of the syllabus, texts that were not part of the syllabus for examination. We would just read them in Greek, for fun. And that was great. It was wonderful, because and my other important classics teacher, Mr. Henderson, he was wonderful too. And we were a very small number of people doing Greek, especially from the age of 15, 16, 17, the more advanced. There were probably only about 3 or 4 boys in the class doing Greek. and so you know it was pretty individual tuition. So it was a great privilege to be studying this language, which was, even in those days, very little studied. Of course, now it's even less studied.
And how did you become interested in modern Greece?
Yes, well, one of my teachers, another teacher, I've mentioned Michael Burley, who was the headmaster, and Henderson, who was the main classics teacher. There was another teacher, Roger Mills, who came to us only for a year. He'd just graduated from Cambridge University, so he was not much older than us, really.
He was a young
one of the things, one of the attractions about Roger was that he had been in the Cambridge Footlights. Now, I don't know whether you've heard of the Cambridge Footlights, but the Cambridge Footlights, I think it still goes on today, was a theatrical group of undergraduates, but instead of putting on plays, they put on satirical shows. And this was the time of Beyond the Fringe and all the sort of political satire that was becoming very fashionable in Britain around about 1960. And he was fresh from Cambridge, and he in fact inspired some of us, including me, to put on a and when I say a satirical show, I mean a review. It was called a review, of course, Epitheorisy. So we put on a review of our own while he was there, that 1 year that he was there. I say just 4 boys, including myself, and we actually wrote the whole thing ourselves and performed in it, you know, entirely ourselves. Anyway, Roger Mills, one of the things he wanted to do was to go to Turkey. And he found that he and his wife, if they got together a group of boys, they could travel free and take us on a classical tour. Now, in order for it to be a classical tour, it had to be Greece as well as Turkey. He really wanted to go to Turkey, but he thought he'd better say Greece as well in order to persuade the boys' parents, you know, that it was worth paying £50, that was all it was, for about a month. We went by train to Istanbul. So we started off in Turkey. And so I saw Turkey before I ever saw Greece.
That was mid-60s?
This was in 1962 when I was 16. And, you know, this was obviously a life-changing experience for me because I saw these two countries for the first time. I'd hardly been abroad. In fact, I think I'd only been abroad once, that's right, once with my parents to France for a few days. So it's only the second time I'd ever been abroad. And, you know, to go straight, of course, by train, so I mean, we were going via Belgium, Germany, Austria, Yugoslavia, and Bulgaria, in fact. But getting off the train to Istanbul and, you know, exploring Istanbul was extraordinary. I mean, our teacher Roger Mills was wonderful, very liberal in the sense that he said, "Look, tomorrow I'm going to Hagia Sophia or the Blue Mosque or, you know, something like that." And he would say, "If you want to come with me, you can. If you don't, you can do what you like." So we were left free, you know, and sometimes we went around with him, sometimes we just, you know, went off.
You were 16 years old, something like that?
Yeah, 16 years old, and we were exploring. We even went to nightclubs and in fact, even to a striptease show. And even went to, this place that Theotokos talks about in Leonis, I think it was called Arbanozi or something. It's this, it was, in English, it's called the Street of a Thousand Whores. And not that I went into any of the whorehouses, but you know, it was quite educative at the age of 16, walking up and down the street, seeing these prostitutes in their doorways and their windows. You know, it was quite.
It's quite of an experience for
it was. You know, for somebody who'd been in a single-sex school, you know, coming from, you know, fairly, what can I say, not quite puritanical background, but you know, sex wasn't something that was ever talked about at home, for instance. You know. Anyway, so then we went by boat from Istanbul to Smyrna, to Izmir, and from there we went to Ephesus. We made a lovely trip to Ephesus, and from there we went by boat to Piraeus. So that was the first time I'd seen Greece. And I should say that which boat did we go on from Izmir to Piraeus? It was a boat belonging to Titalvos lines called the Mediterranean. And it was a sister ship of the Angelica, which were, both of these boats were paddle steamers. You know, they had these big wheels built in Glasgow in 1900, and they were being used by Titalvos lines to take people around the Aegean. The Angelica was actually used in the film of Zorba the Greek, by Kakougiannis. This was the sister ship Mediterranean, which was the same. So that, even that was an experience, you know, going across the Aegean on a paddle steamer, which even in those days was already 60 something years old. And then the first thing I noticed, actually, when the boat was getting near to Piraeus, and we're getting near into the harbour, I think the first word of Greek that I saw was
Modern Greek.
First word of Greek I saw in Greece. It was a neon illuminated sign, Philips. But it was in, in the Greek alphabet.
It was in the Greek alphabet.
And of course, you know, having known in early ancient Greek, I could read it, and I thought it was very amusing. You know, the first word of Greek that I could see in Greece was a foreign marca, you know, which of course is something which continues to go on today. But you know, going from there, none of my teachers at school had ever told me that Greek was still being spoken. And I don't think any of us ever asked, actually, you know, are there still Greeks there speaking Greek? So I have no idea about what sort of language the Greeks were speaking now. It was all classics. And so, you know, there I see the Greek alphabet being used for a, Dutch company name. I think this is interesting, you know, this is modern. And then, you know, I start seeing street signs in the town, in the city, newspaper headlines and things, and I can understand some of it, you know. Of course, not everything, because the word stasis, as you know, in ancient Greek, means a revolution. Whereas in modern Greek, it's a bus stop. So I would see these words stasis around and wondering why they were putting up propaganda for a revolution. You know, it took me some time to realise what was going on. But I could read the letters. And being a kind of, what they would now call a geek, I suppose, I was a Greek geek or a geek Greek. You know, I was very into books and dictionaries and grammars and things. So I bought myself a couple of phrase books, modern Greek phrase books, actually even before I went, and tried to work out some of this language, which I found very, very difficult sometimes. I mean, I could understand a lot of it, but some of it was very difficult. For instance, the things that I really found difficult were nabo. You know, and I learned that you had to pronounce them like that, but I couldn't understand what on earth did this come from until I realised that they came from the ancient Greek verb, which in those days I pronounced as bino, in other words, veno, because of course we use the Erasmian pronunciation.
The Erasmian pronunciation.
Yeah, of course. I mean, everyone did. I mean, no one had even heard of anything except the Erasmian pronunciation in England in those days, at least not at school. And so that was what got me interested, and even though when I was 16 it never occurred to me to go on to study modern Greek, I started teaching myself from then on. You know, buying books and things, and I even bought a copy of Solomos's poems, which is rather difficult modern Greek to begin with, you know, for a beginner. And then when I went to Greece again, because I went to Greece again in 1965, I bought a copy of Seferis's poems, and actually now it turns out that this is the last edition of his poems that he himself edited, because after he died, they were edited by Savidis, and actually I won't go into details here, but there are some differences in the way that the poems are presented, and I prefer I prefer the editions that Seferis himself edited.
And which edition of Solomos have you bought?
Oh, it was a very bad edition by Ekdosis Mari. They were the sort of things probably that were sold off, you know, Kara in the streets of Athens, you know, the sort of things where you open it and all the pages fall out, you know. But I still have it. It's undated, you know. I suppose it dates from the 50s or the 60s. But that was my first book, was Solomos, and the first book I bought was actually in London. And then of course I finished school. I did my exams that's A level, which is the equivalent to the Apolitirio, but of course in England you do it only in a small number of subjects. So I did it in Latin, ancient Greek, ancient history, and French. And I emphasise French because then I went to university, to Oxford. I got a place to read law, and I thought I'd finished with classics. I didn't really want to do any more classics. I'd been doing it for several years, and I started doing law. Really because my father thought it was a good idea, and I didn't have anything against it. I thought, why not? I didn't know what I wanted to do. I had no idea.
No particular preferences or interests?
But I always liked languages, and during that first year studying law, I came to be totally bored, both by law and by the teacher. He was a very bad teacher, our tutor in our college. There were 5 students in that year reading law in St John's College, and it's interesting that 2 out of those 5 dropped out. 2 out of those 5 dropped out of law at the end of the first year. One of them went to do English literature, and I went off to do modern languages. So I was looking around during that year. I thought, I must get out of this, I must get out of this. I didn't want to leave Oxford, but I wanted to leave law. So I asked around, I spoke to lots of people, friends, tutors. I went to see tutors that I didn't know, you know, the modern Greek tutor, the French tutor, asking them. And they said, well, since you've got French A-level, then you can do 2 languages, 2 modern languages. French and modern Greek, because with classical Greek you can learn modern Greek quite easily, which is true. Then so that's what I did for the rest of my Oxford career. So I got my degree in modern languages, that is French and modern Greek.
And then you also, during your studies, you came to Greece again.
That's right.
As a fellow.
No, well, I'll explain. I went there under 3 different ways actually. So I completed my first year at Oxford studying law. Now, I didn't want to spend any more time studying at Oxford because it would have meant that somebody would have had to pay for an extra year. See, obviously the state paid me for my 3 years, but they wouldn't have paid for a 4th. So I decided, after having done 1 year of modern languages, that is after the end of my 2nd year, that I'd go off to Greece for a year. I would take a break in my studies, go off to Greece, pay for everything myself, which I did, and then come back afterwards and get my degree after, if you like, my 4th year, but only 3 years in Oxford, 1 year in Athens. So I went to Athens, and in the meantime I was very lucky because on that trip in 1965 I'd met somebody who's been a friend ever since, a man called Spiros Spiromilios, who's descended from the famous General Spiromilios of the War of Independence. And he had studied at an English public school and Cambridge University, and spoke and still does the most beautiful old-fashioned English. Got a wonderful English accent. He was married to a Scottish lady who also became a friend of mine. He ran a tourist company called the Agener Club, and I worked for him for 2 summers, in the summer of '65 and the summer of '66, on Peloponnesian tours. I was the synodos. I wasn't allowed to call myself a xenagos because you had to have a license, but I would just accompany, you know, sitting in the front seat next to the driver, accompany the tourists, you know, give them a little talk through the microphone before we got to this archaeological site, and then leave it, of course, to the professional guides to do the guiding. So we did these archaeological tours around the Peloponnese, which was great fun, and that was for 2 summers. And then in '66, after that summer, I decided to spend this year in Athens, still, as it were, as an undergraduate from Oxford, and I taught English in Athens. But for the first few months, I was able to stay in a flat belonging to Spiros. It was a flat which was used by his employees who used to come for the summer, for the tourist season. But in the winter, I was allowed to stay there. I paid him rent, but only a very small rent, and then I found my own accommodation when the spring came and the others came out. But Spiros was very helpful to me in all sorts of ways and introduced me to lots of people. But it was during that year, I mean that year in Greece, that first year in Greece was absolutely kathoristikos for me. You know, it was a defining moment in my intellectual development, in my studies, because there I got to know the Greek language well, I got to know a lot of Greeks, I got to know the country in general. I had a car, I was very privileged. I taught English for 70 drachmas an hour, which was like £1, And that was enough for me to work just for, say, 3 days a week, and I could spend the rest of the time reading, studying, and going around in my car, going to beaches and deserted beaches in the middle of the week when everybody was at work, and it was a wonderful time.
Seems you enjoyed it.
I enjoyed it very much, and for the first few months, from say September, October '66 to April, and I'll come back to April '67. I went to the Panepistimiaki Leski in Hippocrates, and I studied modern Greek. I did modern Greek lessons with Davignotis, who later became the famous professor. He was actually
He
was actually a very, very good teacher, very, very good teacher, and very, very nice. I mean, I've since, we've parted ways, and I've fallen out with him, and I don't have any contact with him nowadays. But in those days, he was actually a very, very good teacher, and he was teaching us Dimotiki as well. Not Katharevose, we were doing Dimotiki.
And you learned Greek.
So with his help, and with just being in Greece.
Being in country.
But then when the colonel's coup happened on the 21st, and I'll come back to that, 21st of April, then people who were not registered at Athens University were no longer allowed to go to the Panepistimiaki Leski, so I stopped going to those classes, unfortunately. But of course, yes, one of the most important things that happened during the time, one of the most important things that happened to me during that first year of mine in Athens was the colonel's coup on the 21st of April. And as it happened, on that day, a friend of mine, a Lebanese theology student at Athens University called Michel, he and I were booked on the railway to go by train from Athens to Istanbul on the 21st of April. And we were going to go to visit Istanbul for Easter, Constantinople. And anyway, the coup happened. I woke up in the morning. I was living then in Pankrati. Turned on the radio as I used to get the news, and I heard these Envatiria and Zimotka Tragudia, and then these things were punctuated every so often by an official voice saying something like, in view of the internal and external threat to the security of our country, the king has decided, or something like that, or I have decided, signed the king, to suspend the following articles of the Constitution, and there is a curfew. You're not allowed to go out of the house. You must stay at home, etc., etc. And I thought this is strange.
You could follow the language at that stage.
Of course.
Yeah. You were fluent.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Anyway, the first thing I did was to go out of the house. What do you do? And especially in Greece, I mean, who's going to obey these orders? So I went to the peripteron and said, I didn't have a phone in the flat. And I said, what's going on? And the guy at the peripteron said, katastasi polemo. I said, polemo? Polemos? Όχι ακριβώς. He said, Hunda. Τι να σου πω, Hunda. And I didn't really know what Hunda was, but anyway, I then said, well, I said to him, are the railways working today? He said, railways? Τα τρένα. And obviously not. And I wanted to phone my parents to tell them. Well, first of all, I wanted to phone my friend Michel because we were supposed to be meeting to go on the train to Istanbul. The phones weren't working, of course. I went to the local Ote office. They were closed. To phone, they were closed. The post office was closed. So I decided to walk to my friend Michel, who lived in Kolonaki. So I walked kind of, I suppose, I actually walked through Sindagma. And of course there were one or two tanks outside the Vuli, pointing downwards towards the square, and soldiers at corners, very few people in the streets. Except I remember some American tourists going around the jewellery shops near Sindagma and asking each other, why are these shops closed? What's going on? They didn't seem to have noticed the tanks there. And I just kept walking, and actually no soldier stopped me. And I got to my friend, and we had lunch together. Anyway, the fact was that the trains were working the next day, so we actually went to Istanbul the next day. But it was an extraordinary situation, and I spent that night of the 21st to the 22nd with friends, with Michelle and with some Greek friends. And I remember this was somewhere up high in Kononaki near the Gymnasio. It was Anapiron Polemu, somewhere like that. And this friend who had the flat, I can't even remember his name now, he was very amused that there was a soldier out in the street after dark, you know, stopping people. Well, he was there to stop people if anybody was out because of the curfew. Of course, there was no traffic. And this friend was going out and joking. He was kind of shouting at the policeman and trying to make him scared. And I just remember when occasionally somebody would go by, there were sometimes cars going by, this friend of mine would shout to him, "Fatone!" to the soldier, just to sort of wind him up. Of course the soldier didn't shoot, but he looked very scared. So, and then the next day we left, but it was very interesting going to Istanbul. Oh, first of all, going to Thessaloniki. Thessaloniki station, where we had to change, was absolutely full of people. It was like, you know, people trying to get out. They were trying to get on trains to go to Yugoslavia, of course, and Bulgaria, whatever, just to get out of Greece. And then very few people on the train from Thessaloniki to Istanbul. And when we got to Istanbul, my friend Michel had an introduction to the Patriarch of Constantinople, Athenagoras. So on one of the days of Easter, like whether it was Easter Saturday or whatever, we went to visit him. And he was very friendly, and we, you know, Tsumrisa me avra, I can't know who won, but somehow by going to the church, by going to the Patriarchate, we also met a lot of the local Romius. Who were very friendly to us because they wondered where we'd come from, what we were doing. When we said we'd just come from Greece, we became the most popular people in Istanbul. They were inviting us to their houses all the time because they wanted to know what's it like, what's going on. Somebody told us that they'd heard or read somewhere in a Turkish newspaper that the king had been publicly executed in Sendagma Square. I mean, all sorts of strange rumours going around. So we were able to say, well, as far as we knew, this wasn't the case. And anyway, so that was very interesting. I'm talking too long about that one year, but I mean, it was very educative. By the time I got back to Greece, of course, it was very interesting for an Englishman to be living under a military dictatorship, because it was something which I'd never thought I would ever experience. And I knew a lot of writers, and actually it was when I went back again, because after the summer of '67 I went back to Oxford. I did my last year as an undergraduate, finished my degree.
You finished it.
I then started an MPhil degree in comparative literature, that's French and modern Greek, and then halfway through that, in the summer of '69, I was appointed to a so-called travelling fellowship by Queen's College at Oxford, which allowed me to go off to Greece for 2.5 years at the expense of Queen's College, Oxford. And so I spent 2.5 years from '69 to '72.
For your thesis?
That was when I was working on my doctoral thesis, which was about the Greek novel of the Mesopolemos, of the interval period. And so I was able to meet those novelists who are still alive from that period. Kosmas Politis, who was and still is my favourite Greek novelist, very interesting man. Angelos Terzakis, Thanasis Petsalis, Panderis Prevelakis, who I actually became quite friendly with. Unfortunately, other authors had already died. Minivilis Theotokos had died, although I got to know Theotokos' widow, Koralea, who became a very, very close friend of mine and of Jackie's when we got together.
Tsirkas?
Well, younger people, yes. He was one of the younger writers. He was younger than the generation of 1930, just about. Tsirkas I got to know very well. And even better, I got to know Kostas Taxis, who became a very close friend. And then younger still, you know, I kind of see myself as a sort of honorary member of the Yaniatu Evdomina, because I knew all those people in those days, and it was very exciting because it was at the time and they were just beginning to publish. So Yanis Kondos, Nasios Vagenas, Lefteris Poulios, Vasilis Teriadis, Jenny Mastoraki, Who else?
Rook, Katerina.
Katerina Angelaki Rook was slightly older.
Mhm.
She wasn't Yeniatu Ezominda, but she became my closest friend then in Greece, and she still is today.
Would you like to say a few things about the intellectual climate in Greece at the time?
Yeah.
What sorts of things people were interested? It was the
Yeah.
junta years.
Yeah.
It was very difficult.
Well, it was in that second period in Greece. Those when I was a graduate student from Queen's College, Oxford, doing my research, that I really got into the Greek intellectual scene.
Also, how do you choose this?
Well, that happened to be because one of my professors at Oxford, the professor, was Konstantinos Tripanis, and he was the one who suggested that I work on the novel of the
because in a way he was also a member of...
Yeah, he was of the same generation, and he knew these people. Let's see, I met a lot of writers through two people who were very kind to me and very friendly and very helpful. One of them was Kimon Fryer, the famous Greek-American translator, and he used to have meetings every week in his flat in Kalithoromio Street, and he would gather together young writers, and that's where he used to, literally these were the whole of the Yeniatu Ethnomida. They used to gather in his flat every week, and I used to go along there as well, and they would read their new poems to each other, and Kimon would comment on them, and we would all comment on each other's. I wasn't writing poems, but I was there. And Kimon would start translating them and all that, because he was translating everybody. I mean, everybody from, the 19th century until the very latest, young people. He was amazing. And the other person who was very useful to me was Nikos Yermanakos, who was a Welsh Greek. He was born and bred in Wales, and he had gone to Oxford University a little bit before me, but he was living in Greece and with his wife and children. His wife actually was from Venezuela, she wasn't Greek. And he used to entertain people, well, he and his wife Irma used to entertain people at his house, his flat, and among these people were Thanasis Valtinos, who was a great friend of Nikos, and Tsirkas, and many others. I remember Vasilis Ziogas was often around, but many other people. I think Taxis probably I met through Nikos as well.
And this is during the dictatorship?
This was all during the dictatorship. And I remember actually having long discussions with Tsirkas particularly, because, at the beginning of my stay there, nobody was publishing anything because of the preemptive censorship. And I remember saying to Tsirkas, look, I think you should publish. There was me, a young foreigner, saying to this grand man, I think you should publish because, young people, I said, look, I've got a lot of young Greek friends, and, they're all desperate to read new things. They're all hungry for new things, and I think they need your voice. They need your voice to write for them. And then, of course, obviously the law changed, as you know, at the end of 69 or 70, anyway, whatever, when it was no longer preemptive censorship, but they could always put you in prison, of course, afterwards, but you could publish the books. And then, Zekakdokimena came along and all that. So, of course, I was very pleased when that happened, because I thought, at last, these people are publishing. And I suppose I knew a lot of the people who were in the Zekakdokimena and the Neakimena. And I met Tsirkas. Oh, yes, how I met Tsirkas. Sorry, I met Ritsos. How I met Ritsos. I said I got quite friendly with Prevelakis. Now, Prevelakis is usually associated, I think, in people's minds, maybe yours, with conservatism, right wing, whatever it is. Actually, he wasn't really that right wing. He had flirted with communism in his youth, although that doesn't mean anything. A lot of people do. But he was very fond of Tsirka. Sorry, I keep saying Tsirka. He was very fond of Ritsos. They were born in the same year, which actually was the year that my father was born, which I think was quite interesting for me. 1909, and Prevelakis saw Ritsos as being a synodiporos, somebody who'd gone along some of the same road as him. Now, Ritsos at that time was under house arrest in Karlovasi in Samos, and I was planning to go to Samos anyway, where I got some friends, and I told Prevelakis I was going, and he said, well, when you go, please go to Ritsos, and please tell him that I sent you, and that I'm sending him all my love and encouragement and best wishes.
Mm-hmm.
So I was very touched by that, of course, myself, because I thought, Prevelakis and Ritsos, they don't seem to come from the same political camp. They don't, of course. But as you probably know, after was it after Ritsos died, Prevelakis wrote a whole book about Ritsos,
Yes.
and he said rather jokingly that he was probably the only person in the world apart from Ritsos who had read every word that Ritsos had ever written. It's quite a good book. And so I did go and see Ritsos there, and he was very friendly and welcoming, and I gave him Prevelakis this message, which was then, of course, returned and reciprocated. So I used to go and see Ritsos. Once he was then in Athens, I used to go and see him there. I was, of course, very conscious of the intellectual resistance against the colonels, but I wasn't actually part of it myself. And although I didn't know anybody who was actually in prison at the time, because of course I arrived, in '69 to do my research, the colonels had already been there for 2.5 years. There were already people in prison. But I do remember meeting in Aegina once with some friends, 3 very nice ladies who were visiting Aegina because their husbands were in prison. One of them was the wife of Dimitris Maronitis, one of them was the wife of Pavlos Zanas, and the other one I now can't remember. But anyway, when Maronitis came out of prison, when Zanas came out of prison, I was there at the time, and I met them, through their wives, because I got to know their wives. I got to know them, and of course, so although I didn't know people who were in prison at night, I knew people once they'd come out of prison. So of course, I was very much, sympathetic to their sufferings, to their outlook, and to what they're doing, etc. But I wasn't involved in any kind of activity myself. I was also very aware of the way that some people like Kostas Taktsis and Kate Tsitseli, Kate became a great friend of mine as well, were very much criticised because they accepted money from the Ford Foundation during the Colonel's period, which gave them enough money to go to America, and I think Kostas Taktsis even bought a flat with this money that he got from the Ford Foundation. So they were accused by people on the left of betrayal, if you like, and so I was very, very much sort of aware of these things. I also knew Eli Alexiou, who seems to have been free. I don't think she was under house arrest. She may have been arrested right at the very beginning, but by the time I was there in '69, she was living a normal life in her flat. Of course, she'd been living in East Germany, I suppose, or was it Hungary? Anyway, behind the Iron Curtain.
East Germany.
East Germany. And I also met her friend, the critic, whose name I now can't remember, sorry, it's disappeared from my mind. He was known as Oyatros. Marcos Avieris, who was really called Yorgos Papadopoulos, just like the dictator, but Marcos Avieris was his pseudonymous. I met him, and quite a lot of associates of Eli Alexiou. Eli was very helpful to me. I went to see her because of the research on my thesis. So I met a lot of people through her, but I also met I met through Yanis Kondos. I met Kanelopoulos, for instance, some of the politicians.
You also did some editing for the Historia του Ελληνικού Έθνους.
Yes.
Was it considered to be a big project at the time?
Well, it was, yes. This was when, you see, I returned to Oxford in '72, and I finished off my thesis, and that was that. And then after I'd done that, I didn't know what to do, so I still didn't have any idea of what career I had in mind. I went back to Greece in January of '73, and I was prepared to stay there indefinitely. I knew that I could find work, which I did, just part-time work,
Teaching,
freelance work. Not much teaching, but a bit of translating, a bit of editing, a bit of... I even worked as a consultant for an advertising agent because my father was an advertising agent, and I'd worked in my father's office for a year actually. I found an advertising agent who I met seemed to think that it was good for his clients if he had a young Englishman who knew all about the latest advertising techniques in England who could come along and advise him. And he used to pay me quite well for that, and I used to say very little. But one of the jobs I got was with Exotique Athénon, and this was a job I found through Philip Sherrard, who I'd got to know and became friendly with. He was actually organising the translation of the first few volumes of the Historieto Hellenico Ethnos into English. And in fact, some of those volumes were published in English, although I don't think it proceeded beyond a certain point. So at that time, when I was there, I'm talking about 73. Okay. At that time, they were already quite far advanced in the Greek edition. They were already producing. They were already publishing volumes about the Hellenistic period, and afterwards, I think Byzantine, etc. But in English, they were publishing the very early ones, the prehistory. So I was translating some of the only very small parts of the prehistory sections for the English version, because there were a whole team of translators. I was just one of many. But I was also helping with some copy editing of the Greek version, and that meant going to the Archeologia Archaeoteria and looking up references in the library there. That was very interesting, and checking people's references and reading through their... Not that I wasn't correcting their Greek, of course, but I was correcting some factual things that I was finding out. So it was quite nice. I was entrusted to do this sort of research work by the company. And Exotique Athénon seemed to have a lot of money. I don't know where it came from, I never asked. But the people there were very friendly. There was Yanis Bastias, who was the son of Kostas Bastias, and a man called Christopoulos. They were the guys in charge. But the most interesting thing for me about working for Exotique Athénon, as I say, it wasn't a full-time job in any way, it was just freelance. I used to go to the office just to hand over work, to collect money, but I didn't spend very long there. I was working at home generally. The most interesting aspect was that I met some young historians who were also working, but they were working probably full-time for Exotique Athénon at the time.
Like Veremis.
There was Thanos Veremis, Yanis Koliopoulos, and Miltos Chatzopoulos, who became a Roman historian, as you know, whereas the other two, of course, are famous for their modern history. And although I don't see Miltos much nowadays, I do see Thanos and even Yanis Koliopoulos, who, as you know, has been very unwell for some time, but I occasionally manage to get to see him in Thessaloniki, and he's a very dear friend, a very dear person. I'm very, very fond of him and his wife, Christina. They're among our best friends in Greece. So some of these friendships go back to that time. And now
early 70s.
73, that's right, which is 40 years plus. But also during those periods, of course, I met a lot of Greek friends, who are not necessarily involved in literature or whatever, and I still see them, now, which is great. And I sometimes feel that I've got more friends in Greece than I have in Britain.